All right, I'm going to start by reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting at verse 1. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should feel his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you and because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift and another has that. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the day. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the opportunity to study it. We thank you for the ability to research it and learn what you want us to do. In your son's name, amen. All right, last week we took a look at primarily chapter 6, talking about, and it's actually 5 ends, talking about immorality, starting with the fact, I think it was in chapter 5, the immoral brother, the one that was found to be be married to his father's wife. And he calls them out about that and addresses that issue to them very strongly and very specifically. He starts off by telling them that continuing to live an immoral life, as in this particular example, is not acceptable under any circumstances. If you're going to live that way, they shouldn't be in the fellowship of the church. And he's going to go on and talk about that. When he starts talking about making judgments based on the actions of people in the church, specifically this individual, and he addresses the fact that it is in the Lord Jesus. The fact is that those judgments are based on the teachings of Jesus. They were clearly something they could see, and actions that they were doing was in contrast to what Jesus said, and they continued to do it as if it was okay. That was the situation. It was not a sin that they had committed and they were repentant of. It was not a situation that somebody said, he said, she said. It was not any of those things, and it was not a matter of opinion. It was something that was clearly laid out. Matter of fact, in Leviticus, it defines it in the Bible specifically. And of course, the teaching of Jesus were pretty clear about it as well. And it was pointed out that even the pagans don't even believe in that. As a matter of fact, at that time, there was a common, I'm not going to say a myth because it was a combination of myth and fact or whatever, about a person named Oedipus. Freud used Oedipus for the Oedipus named a situation, the Oedipus whatever, which has to do with the person loving their mother in essence or whatever. Relations with their mother. And so even the pagans said that was not okay. And they related to this particular story. And so all of them were familiar with that. So basically it was a clear teaching, and we talked quite a bit about judgment and the fact that where judgment comes in and doesn't. It has to do with the actions that are clearly in contrast with the teachings of the law of Christ, of God, and has to do with the fact that they continue to do those as if it was okay, and fellowship with the church. And that's where the judgment comes in, and Paul brings it out. So he goes on to make judgments based on the teachings of Jesus, and then hand the brother over to Satan that he may be saved. The point being, it wasn't to be lost. Didn't hand him over to Satan to get vengeance on him or to get rid of him. It was in order that he might be saved. And I pointed out that when you study 2 Corinthians, it appears that it worked. He was brought back into the fold. He goes on and chastises them for being proud. Apparently they felt like they were being tolerant, and they were being good Christians because they were tolerant of sinners. And he says, no, this is more than just being tolerant of the sinner. This is being tolerant of sin and allowing it to continue in the church. And that is not okay to be tolerant of that. Instead, he says, get rid of the old yeast. the yeast that infects the rest of the batch. And he says, get rid of that because it just contaminates. And whatever it does, destroys. And he didn't want the whole church to be contaminated. And eventually it would, not just outside the church, people would look in and say, well, they're no different than us. But also that those in the church would be seen and say, well, that's his thing. I can do my problems, the things I have issues with. And therefore, they would all feel that sin could continue. So he goes on and says, put the immoral or the unrepentant man out of the fellowship. We talked about immorality more specifically later in that chapter and then throughout chapter 6. And it defines it in various types of sexual immorality, various types of idolatry, various types of greed, various types, specifically drunkenness, and various types of language or slander. And he goes on to say everything is permissible but not always beneficial. What he's trying to say is that God created all things good, including man himself. But sin comes from abuse, excess, and mastery. Those things take what is good, man, and causes sin. What is good, food, causes sin. What is good, sex, causes abused or one of these things, or then it becomes sin. So it comes because of that. The sinful, he goes on to say, the sinful will not inherit the kingdom of God. That's why they became Christians, so that they would become part of God's kingdom, that they would inherit in that they would be his children. He says the sinful is not going to inherit it. As a matter of fact, Jesus Christ himself washed you, justified you, which means made you okay, removed the sin, and paid the price for it, and sanctified you, or made you holy, made you capable, the ability to be in the presence of God and his kingdom. So you were like that. Matter of fact, he says, he describes all the sins, he says, just like all of you were at one time. He says, but you're not because of these things. So God has sanctified you. He says and goes on to say that sexual immorality is a sin against self, whereas all other sins are a sin against others. Sexual immorality is actually a sin against yourself, against the body. He goes on to say, do not be united with a prostitute. Specifically, he was talking about the 1,000 prostitutes that were up on the hill there at Aphrodite's temple. Don't be connected with them. Those were priestesses to another god, to Aphrodite. He's saying don't participate in any of that idol worship, sexual immorality, all the things associated with that. Do not be united with a prostitute, but be united with God and his Spirit. That's what you were united to, Romans 6, when you were buried with him in Christ. All right. So he talks about all this sexual immorality in the last two chapters. I mean, immorality as a whole, but it's real specifically about sexual immorality because that is a big problem at Corinth, which we keep pointing out, because the temple is right there to Aphrodite. And then he goes into chapter 7 and he goes to the flip side. And he talks about the response to sexual immorality is this. And that's where we started reading today, is in chapter 7. And as a matter of fact, apparently it was some questions that have been brought up. What to do, how to deal with this. Because he says, now concerning some matters you brought up. And he says, it is good for a man not to marry. What's he saying? Guys, what's he telling you? Don't get married. It's not just that. What was he trying to say here?
Don't get married unless you be faithful to.
All right, yeah. This is not about, it's about commitment. It's about being faithful. He also is going to talk about the fact that marriage brings a lot of problems. And he's saying, so for that reason, it's better not to be married. Okay, so he says, it is good not to... Let me see. Good not to marry. I have a different translation. It said something different. What did I say? Another translation says it is good not to have sexual relations with a woman. In that same translation there. So it depends on the translation it's in. It means the same thing or whatever. It has to deal with that. It's better to be separated from that particular relationship. But, and here's where he goes on. He says, but since there is so much immorality, which is what he just spent 2 chapters talking about, the immorality that was going on, and since all this is going on, then each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Okay? So basically he's saying that, where's this version? Let me get this one here. Okay? Because another version says that. All right. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. So he's saying that since there is this problem, then you need to be married. You need to deal with it. When he's saying this, a man should have sex with his own wife and vice versa. Almost everything he talks about is vice versa. So he goes in, he says, man with a wife, same with a woman, needs to be with her husband. And he goes on to say, with regard to sex, that a husband should fulfill his marital duty. He's talking about relationships with her, having sexual relations with her, so that she will not be caught up in this situation where she will be tempted to have relations outside of this marriage. The same goes for her. She is to fulfill her marital duty, which is to have sex with him so that he will not be tempted to be looking for relations outside of the marriage. And he goes on to be a little more specific and clarifies, and he says, wife does not have authority over her body, but yields, which means she chooses, yields to him. And a husband does not have authority over his body, but yields to her. The purpose is God made it in order that sexual union would be made whole like he designed it in marriage. And that's what this is all about. But it has to take place. If it doesn't take place, then it causes one or the other to be tempted. And so to eliminate temptation, he says, make sure that you, whichever you are, husband or wife, that you make sure that your spouse is satisfied, taken care of, whatever. You've done your obligation there for her or him in order to do this. Okay? He says, do not deprive or do not withhold sex except by mutual consent. And that is just where 2 people decide for some particular reason. And the reason he gave here was to commit themselves to prayer, like as in fasting, a commitment to there. But the concept is that it has to do with anything that you need to step back for a minute and together think about something or deal with something or whatever it may be. But it's only for a time. And then he says only for a time, or the problem that will come in is that Satan will tempt, and then because of lack of self-control, the other individual may give in to the temptation, and then they'll be right back in that sexual immorality that he's trying to avoid. So it goes back to the chapter before where it's talking about sin and the fact that it had to do with abuse of it. Nothing wrong with sex. And he's trying to say it's very right in this context. So don't let it get out of this and become what has happened throughout Corinth. As a matter of fact, the whole place of Corinth was about immorality. I mean, when you read the New Testament, of all the books that Paul writes, he talks about immorality, obviously, in all of them, or pretty much. But when it comes to Corinth, it's bam, bam, bam. one right after another, which is one of the reasons I tried to show those pictures of what all they had to deal with. The church there was right in the midst of Satan's den, if you want to call it that. In whatever form or fashion it was right there. So, he says, don't deprive except by mutual consent, and then only for a time so that Satan won't step in and tempt and bring you down and cause sin. All right, does that make sense? Does everybody understand? I think it's pretty clear there, but it's what Paul said, and I want to say what Paul said. Hopefully I wasn't too blunt. But he goes on, and this whole chapter talks a lot about marriage, because marriage is the contrast, the acceptance versus the unacceptable sexual relations, the immoral type sexual relations and all that. So he's going to spend some time in this chapter concentrating on what it is in marriage that's okay. So he goes from there and he starts talking about in verse 8. And he says, verse 8, now to the unmarried and the widows, I say this. Now, in reality, when he talks about the unmarried, who's he talking about? He's not just talking about anyone who's unmarried, because he said the unmarried and widows. Widows are unmarried. But he's talking about, and later he's going to talk about virgins. So he's talking about those who are no longer married. As a matter of fact, I think the writer points out that even in the language of using that word, it's masculine and blah, 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 whatever. I'm not a Greek expert, but that there's more to it than just being a person who is unmarried. It's that they were married. So here we are. They're unmarried. And he says to them, so the unmarried, previously married, and widows, it's best to do what? Do what? Remain unmarried. Matter of fact, I've heard some people that were married, widows, whatever, and say, never again. Why? Because it brings a lot of issues, a lot of troubles, but specifically in Paul's time. And he goes on to say that to the unmarried and the widows, I say it's good. He didn't say it's best. He didn't say it was worst. He just says it's good to stay unmarried, as I do. So Paul clearly defines that he was an unmarried person. Whatever. In contrast, we're going to find that Peter, who people treat as being the Pope who was unmarried, was actually married. Paul says he was married, which is kind of strange that they would people would flip that and what it is. Paul was the unmarried one, and he says it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do, as Paul does. However, if they can't control themselves, there's that self-control again. If they can't keep under control, then they should marry. And so even though he says it's probably best, and I'm going to say probably because he didn't say best, he said it was good, probably best to not marry, most people can't live up to that. Instead, they have, they are drawn. They have that desire. Therefore, he's saying, if you got that, what you need to do is don't go up on the hill. You should get married. That's what he's saying. But if they can't control, they should marry. For it is better for a person to marry than to burn with passion or to live a life that is being drawn by that sexual desire that's causing them to commit adultery with somebody else's wife, or to go up with the prostitute or the priestess up on the temple or wherever it may be. He's saying it's better to marry than burn in that situation. Okay? All right. And then he goes on and he says, to the married, that was the unmarried, to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. Okay, this is something God said. First of all, a wife must not separate from her husband, must not divorce her husband. Okay? As a matter of fact, one of the scriptures I pulled up is in Matthew 19. It's also in Mark, and I think, no, Luke does not have it, but in Matthew and Mark, both of them, says, what God has joined together, let no man separate, quote unquote. That's Jesus. So when Paul's saying this, he's saying they should must not separate from her husband, and he's going to talk about husbands not divorcing. He's saying that if God puts it together, and that's the stipulation, if God does it. See, some marriages God doesn't put together. So if God puts it together, man's not supposed to tear it apart. Let no one separate. And he goes on and says, if she does separate or divorce, then she must remain unmarried or get back with her husband. Be reconciled with her husband, not just get back with her husband, but be reconciled. The idea here that Paul's trying to put off is, first of all, and he's going to get more detailed as he goes through it, but and there's a lot of debate and, understanding. People have a more conservative or more liberal view. I'm not trying to espouse one or the other. What I'm trying to say is what it appears to be, and certain understandings can go one way or the other. And when that takes place, that's okay. Just remember to don't bind your particular understanding on somebody else or whatever, because it is what it is. And sometimes we're not in the position to judge exactly what God meant by that. But anyway, with that being said and going on, he's saying here that if she, the idea being, first of all, that she, who's he writing to? Let me ask this question. Who's he writing to right here? 1 Corinthians is written to who? The church at Corinth. So the church is who? The believers, those who have been buried with Christ and raised up with him. So he's writing to the married woman who is a believer. Okay? He's not writing to her neighbor who is a woman who's a non-believer. His ability and what he has to do with that marriage is not there. Whatever they have done on their own. Whether they're living with somebody or their father's wife or they've been married at the courthouse or whatever, that's not anything with him. He's talking about a marriage that God has sanctified, and he's going to talk about that in a little bit, more in a minute. So he's talking about the believer, and he's talking to the believer. So here he's talking, to the believer and not the non-believer. So he's talking to the believing woman, Christian woman, and says, don't separate from her husband. Okay? What God has put together, don't separate. And he's going to go on to say that God now makes this union okay. But if she must, then to remain unmarried. Why would she must? Aside from the fact he's going to address in just a minute that's kind of different, the fact that he chooses to walk away. But she makes the decision to step away. Where is she living? She's the church at Corinth. Corinth is one of the most wicked cities you'll find. Her husband may be one of the most wicked, sinful people there is. And it may be that she cannot feel that she can stay in that situation. And so he says for her to step away or be separated if she must, but remain unmarried. Because she can't be around it. Or be reconciled. Reconciled is more than just going back to him. Reconciled means something took place. There was a conversation on both sides somewhere along the line to where she was able to reconcile and live her life in such a way that she can still live with him. Does that make sense? And so that is the situation he's talking to there about the married Corinthian Christian woman. She's got two choices in this particular situation. If he stays, then she really should stay with him if at all possible. But if that's a problem and she must leave, then stay to yourself. or get back with him under a reconciliation, some kind of terms. Keep in mind, when we talk about reconciliation with God, what does it take? It takes us to do what God said and him to agree to it before we can actually be his children. That's what Christ did, was reconciled us. He brought us back together in such a way that we can continue on. Okay? And that's what he's saying there. Then he goes on, he says, husbands, he doesn't say separate. What does he say? Don't divorce your wife, period. He doesn't say if you must, then go and then do da. No, he says don't. Even if she's in that situation that the woman married in the situation where the wife is a pagan in essence, as the husband, he still goes back to what Jesus said in Matthew 19. Husbands, do not divorce your wife. Okay? Even because he's the man of the house or whatever, he's not supposed to walk away from her in spite of the fact that she's a pagan. So he says point blank to him, there's no if you must. This is don't. And he goes back to Jesus' command, and then in Jesus' command, when he's brought there, if you'll remember, there was a conversation that went on, something like this. Well, yeah, but Moses said we could get divorced. And Jesus puts in the exception, which qualifies in all situations, but in that exception, and that exception is for what? Unfaithfulness. Sexual immorality. Except for sexual immorality. But then he puts a big asterisk on it. What does he say after that? Because your hearts were hardened. It was not that way from the beginning. God had never intended. As a matter of fact, you go to Malachi. In Malachi, God says, what? God hates divorce. He hates it. He doesn't care how much adultery went on or how much sexual immorality. He still hates it. Even though he gives an out because of the hardness of their heart, God still hates it. Period. As a matter of fact, you ever read the book of Hosea? God has Hosea give you the perfect example of how God treats his adulterous wife, us. And he teaches us that that's really what he expects out of Hosea and man when you have an adulterous wife. Yeah, there's a clause because the hardness of your heart, Moses put and said, okay, accept whatever. But that's not the first out. That should be the very last because why? God hates divorce. And so when it comes to that, he's there. And so here he is telling this man who's married to a pagan woman, and he's telling him, don't divorce her. Don't divorce her. Has she committed adultery? Well, she's a pagan. There's a very high likelihood. It's all around them. But whether she did or didn't, he says, don't divorce her. So that was the responsibility that was laid out there. Don't divorce your wife. And he goes on, and and I already gave you the Matthew, what Jesus said in Matthew and in Mark and in Luke, all three of those gospels, synoptic gospels. All right, enough about that. Verse 12. To the rest, he's talking about a different group. I say this, and he says, I, not the Lord. Okay? That means this is a recommendation. Okay? Now, he is an apostle. He is blessed with divine inspiration. So he has the ability to know, as he's already told you, this is what God, the Lord says. Well, this is what I'm telling you, based on what the Lord, everything else the Lord has said. I'm going to tell you and make a recommendation. Now he's going to talk to the different group. That is the group that a believer who's married to a non-believer, but there's not that situation there. Instead, the non-believer decides to leave. Because the very real situation is when a man became a Christian, or let's talk about, you're going to start with the women, but he talks about them both. So it's vice versa. It's the same, okay? When a woman married and, first of all, a woman became a Christian and her husband was not, and he believed in all these pagan practices and everything was okay and da-da-da-da-da, she was put in a position of what to do. And it says that if he looks at her and says, hey, I don't want nothing to do with that Christianity stuff, and he wants out, he says, go ahead, let him go. It's okay. It's not a problem. He just told her the ones that the man wanted to stay with him, if you can. Now he's saying if he wants to leave, what do? Let him go. And when he says to let him go, or gentlemen, same thing. If the wife is a non-believer and she wants to go, let her go. You're not under control of her life. You're not in control of that situation. You have nothing to do with it. And then he brings out a point there. He says, do not divorce if the unmarried is willing to remain. And he says that the marriage is made holy in God's eyes, that's where holiness comes in, by who? Obviously by God, but God makes it holy by the believer. So as long as the two of them are together, God has chosen to make that relationship holy or sanctified. So as long as they're married, he's willing to make it, even though it was not a marriage made in heaven, or whatever that expression is. It's not a marriage that was put together by him and sanctified by him when they were first married. But now, as long as she decides to remain, he will make that a holy marriage, and he will bless or make holy their children, the result of this relationship. So we have a situation here where now he's going to make it holy if they stay together because of the believer. But if the non-believer decides to go, let him go. Yes, ma'am.
Couldn't that be his opinion of, like, if they're wanting to leave anyway, then by trying to hold on to them, they could be pulling you further away?
Yeah.
And obviously vice versa. And that if they want to stay, then there is hope that they would want to then turn from the pagan ways.
I like the way you put that, but there is hope, because he's going to go down later and he say, there's no way women, that you're going to convince your unbelieving spouse, or men, or whatever, unbelieving spouse. But like you said, there's hope. And it went right over my head. Believing.
Talks about that they may be saved.
Do what?
That they may be brought to God.
Right. And so, before that you said what? Say that again.
If they wanted to leave, then by trying to hold on to them and keep them in the marriage, they could pull the believer away.
Pull the believer away. That's what pull the believer away. When Israel, God's wife, went into Israel, the people, went into the land, what did he tell them to do? Obliterate every single thing. Why? So that they would not be dragged away from him. And that goes to exactly what you're saying there. There's God's perfect example there showing what happens when you have a situation like that. So as long as they're willing to stay, there is hope. There is a potential. And so go ahead and do it, and God will bless the union, and he will consider it a marriage that he has made holy. If they don't, they want to leave, let them go. You don't know if you can save your spouse or not. You have no control over that, and so you don't know where it's going to go. And more than likely, as she said, with the hope part thrown in, if they're ready to leave, there's probably not much hope anyway. They have already made a decision, I want nothing of this, and so they've left. Yes, sir.
During this time, I'm sure there was a lot of partners, people that had become Christians wanting to distance themselves from the Christian that had become a Christian because of the danger involved being because of persecution.
Persecution, yeah. But more than likely, the more prevalent thing was the fact that I'm used to hanging out with this crowd, and now suddenly, which is not a very good crowd, what's going on and all the things that are going on with all the partying, the gluttony, the sex, all the different things that happened in Corinth at this time. It was more of that. But yes, the persecution. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons Paul's going to tell us in just a minute. One of the reasons not to get married is because of the persecution issue. Okay? So he goes on and he says that this believer, it let him go, and he says that the believer is not bound. Now, there are different interpretations of bound, and I'll just tell you that right now. Some people will take that to the conservative end and say bound really has nothing to do with marriage and divorce. It has to do with the idea of, or some, the teachings or something related to something or whatever. On the other hand, others will turn around and say that bound has to do with being bound in marriage, tied together. I submit to you, it's bound together as marriage. So if you're no longer bound, you're no longer under the obligations of marriage. And the reason I say that is because when you go down to verse 39, when it talks about widows, he pretty much flat out says, talks about being bound to your husband till he dies. And then when he dies, you're no longer bound, you're free to marry. So people use this in different ways and understandings when it comes to remarriage as to what bound means. I think it means, and this is what I believe based on that verse, that when he says no longer bound, that means the ties of marriage have been cut and you're free to remarry under whatever circumstances and recommendations Paul makes. All right, going on. He goes on from that in verse 17. Verse 17. He goes on and says that nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him, to which God is called down. All right, he's going to go on for the next several verses all the way through 24, and he's going to talk about basically his belief, his recommendation is that every person should remain, it's not an absolute, it's his recommendation, should remain in the situation that they were in when they were called, when they became a Christian. If you were married, stay married. If you're unmarried, stay unmarried. If you were a slave, be a slave. If you're a free man, be a free man. If you're circumcised, a Jew, remain circumcised. If you're uncircumcised, don't try to become a Jew, stay uncircumcised. All of those situations are the ones that he brings out. The idea being, it's best that when you're called to be a Christian, go forward as being a Christian in whatever situation you were in. Don't do that, except set aside the sin, obviously, and become united with Christ instead of united with immorality. And so he says that's the position that he thinks is best, which is why he says, it was telling him it's better not to marry. If you're not married, don't do it. He believes that the situation you're in is the best way to move forward. Is that absolute? Well, no. As a matter of fact, there are times that he has encouraged others. He took and had Timothy circumcised. He was uncircumcised when he was a Christian, became a Christian, but he had him circumcised. Why? Because it was convenient and it had a benefit for some other things in his teaching. So there are times when you do those things, even though he didn't really teach Timothy or anybody else to buy into the Jewish culture. But the point being, it's best to stay in the situation you're in. And in this one, he's talking about marriage again. He's going to go on in verse 25, and he's going to talk about virgins. And he's going to tell them, if you're an unmarried virgin, never been married, never whatever, he says, best to remain that way. Incidentally, Jesus agreed with that. In Matthew 19, verses 10 through 11, when the Pharisees asked him, well, it's better not to get married then. And he said, well, yeah, that's true. Basically, he said, that's true. But some people can be a eunuch and some people can't. Some are by choice, some are by blah, 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 and goes on. So basically, he kind of agrees with Paul there for other reasons, for specific reasons. But he goes on, and Paul says, but if you're engaged, don't break off the engagement. Honor your commitment. If you're not engaged, don't go looking for a wife. Stay where you're at. You'll be better off. And then he goes on and he says, and those who marry, verse 28, he says, but in those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you of this. Anybody that's married faced any troubles? I don't think that's the kind he was talking about, but probably because you had children and everything else, you had all those issues brought into it. But specifically, what was brought out by Rick here was the times of persecution and the things that were going on to Christians was going to be very serious. And if you have a wife, how does that make you think when you're called on the carpet? You know, when things come. Now you've divided between your family and Christ, what to do, and the things that were going to take place over the next 50, 100 years that were about to start taking place to Christians. So he's saying because of persecution and all the troubles, also the marital troubles that come along with it, because there's definitely issues that come along when two try to be one. And when two try to be one, then have 7 kids or whatever. You know, it just becomes lots and lots of issues to deal with. So he's saying that. So don't go be looking for a wife if you don't have one. His recommendation. And then the last thing he finishes it up, verse 39 and 40, he says, a woman is bound to her husband for life, but if her husband dies, she is no longer bound, and she's free to marry. But only in the Lord. Why? Let's go back to that sanctioning business. God sanctioned the non-believer's marriage when one of them became a Christian. Then he suddenly steps in and sanctions it. Now he's saying you're a believer and you're going to remarry. If God's going to sanction it, make sure that you bring another believer into it. And then God sanctions the marriage between believers. All right, so marriage only in the Lord. And then per Paul, he goes on and says she'll be happier if she's unmarried, to remain unmarried. The widow, it'd be better off to not be married. And that was his recommendation. As a matter of fact, in 1 Timothy, he also kind of puts a caveat on that. And she says, if you're a young widow, what is she supposed to do? Get married. You know, go get married. Why? Because your sensuality will become an issue for you. You're running around being busybodies and idols. Idle talk and idle actions will become issues. So don't let that become an issue. Get married, have children, have a family, and go to work and be a Christian. So he flips himself when he's telling Timothy and talks about young widows because of the situation. Now, does that mean a young widow can live as he is? No, absolutely. And he would encourage that if she could. If she could be the kind of person that she needs to be and wouldn't be in those situations that he tells Timothy to chastise these young widows about. So
I think some of that too is probably cultural. It was still in that Middle Eastern culture today. Women have no rights
yeah,
in a marriage. And so when you take that on, you take it on the loss.
that's true.
You've given up any freedom that you had. And so just culturally, it was going to be harder for a woman than it was a man.
That's true. That's true. All right. Anything else? hope we're all together, and I didn't say anything that I didn't think through incorrectly or something. But if you got any questions or any issues, bring it to me. Yes, sir.
The verse 32 that talks about the whole purpose, the reason he's said, given all this instruction was, it's for your own good, not to restrict you, so that you may live a godly, righteous way, and undivided devotion to God. So that's where he said, hey, wherever you are, stay focused on God. That way you don't get distracted by
Right. But it's not just that. It's even in all those other situations we just rattled off there. All of them is about that commitment to God and to keep you from being, as she was talking about, pulled back into that idolatrous world that was all around them in such magnitude that we don't really understand, because we don't have that pulling on us, quite honestly, like they had right there. All right, next week we're going to look at the next chapter, which is chapter 8, which is number 7 in the book. And I think it's dealing with meat, idol worship. Go from there.